We got you laughing, so we know you're having fun. Whenever you're ready. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Betty Carlton. I'd like to share with you my experience with Diveheart as a parent of a young adult with autism, as well as a professional with a background of over 17 years working with children and adults with special needs. My son was given the opportunity to experience scuba diving over 5 years ago, where Jim Elliott of Diveheart was his instructor, and his world was changed forever through his experience with scuba diving. Beyond that, I have the opportunity now to work with young adults with developmental disabilities, and we are excited to see the opportunities that will come in their life in the form of scuba and recreational therapy. It'll be an opportunity to share with my students and with other instructors and dive buddies my background, my experience, and my education, as well as my own personal involvement working with these populations. Beyond the realm of disabilities is the person. It's always important to take it back to the person. So whether the person is a child, an adult, or a veteran, taking it back to the person and understanding that that person has hopes and dreams just the same as you and I will help make you the best instructor or dive buddy that you can be. Some important things to remember when working with any individual with a disability is understanding the nature of that person's own acceptance of their disability. It's important to understand that not everyone is at the same place in accepting the challenges they face in their life. So by maximizing their abilities and looking at their strengths and their skill sets in a positive way, you also have the opportunity to help them see themselves in a new paradigm, to see themselves in a new way. For working with individuals with disabilities, if you don't have a background in special education or a background in disabilities, it doesn't limit your opportunity to work with these individuals. You just want to remember to go at a pace that that individual is comfortable with, to not try to have an agenda that says you're going to learn the basics of Scuba Diving 101 in a regular standard open water course, that their learning trajectory may just require more time. You always want to take it back to their understanding and their comprehension of the skills that you're focusing on. You want to take it back to that very basic element of pleasure and enjoyment. That's what we all get out of the underwater world, is pleasure and enjoyment. We want it to be pleasurable and enjoyable for them. We want to make it a fun, interactive environment. And most of all, we want to give them the opportunity to experience something that may not have ever been considered in their life before, but look at the possibilities that exist after that. When working with an individual with a physical impairment, it is important to understand their range of motion. It's important to understand their needs, whether those needs come into the form of valve program, catheterization, the way in which they need their physical assistance met. For intellectual or cognitive challenges, it's important to understand their communication needs. It's important to find a way, a medium, in which their communication needs can be met in a learning environment. But fundamentally, the core of any instruction goes back to the relationship you have as instructor or buddy to the learner. So building that relationship first, helping understand the needs of that individual, helping them advocate for themselves, and helping them see their disability in a positive way will go a long way in their future and help them see themselves as a more able-bodied person, a more gifted person. If a student comes to you and wants to begin exploring the opportunities for scuba diving as an instructor or a buddy, well, it's important to understand their diagnosis. It's important to understand what is related to that diagnosis. It can be challenging to feel as though you have to suddenly become a disability specialist. There are more rare forms of disability that come from genetic origin or birth defects. If you are working with an individual who has a more rare or a less frequent diagnostic rate that falls outside of the realm of mild mental retardation or autism, tools that you can look at would be resources, generic resources in your local area. Generic resources can be developmental centers that work with individuals with that specific disability. You can also look on the internet, although I caution you strongly to only go with empirical research on disabilities, not look to Wikipedia or other areas that can be modified through lay terms but has to be qualified through empirical studies. It's important in understanding disabilities that you look to qualified information. You look to truly refined information on a disability and not take someone's word or take a generic Wikipedia resource into account when you're working with that individual. The best resource you have most likely is going to be families. Another resource that you have may be professionals in the community. If you have the opportunity to work with special recreation districts or physical therapists, or occupational therapists, or speech and language pathologists. If your network allows for that, the other great thing that you can do for quick research is just simply begin by networking through your local service organizations. Some of the local service organizations that we have are Autism Society of America. You can also look to Easter Seals. They serve a lot of different types of disabilities, but they have a lot of resources, generic resources available by their website or in their local chapters. Another area that you can look at when trying to find resources about a certain disability or a certain subgroup of disabilities is to be able to look within the medical realm, also be able to look within developmental specialists that might be in the area. Your local area may not have resources immediately available, but if you truly just start asking questions within the realm of special services, human services, you will find the answers that you need in order to work with that individual. In working with any disability, whether it be an ambulatory or physical disability or a cognitive or intellectual disability, or factors that affect both. We may have individuals that have dual diagnosis or comorbid conditions, diagnosis of an intellectual impairment as well as a developmental disability, or the result of a physical impairment as well as an intellectual disability. It's important to understand the way in which diagnosis does equate to quality of life, the way in which the diagnosis does equate to the person, and always putting the person first. Person-centered approach is always the best approach because you're looking at the person, not the disability. You're looking at their abilities rather than their disability. You're looking at the skills they have and how to build upon those skills rather than looking at the deficits that that individual may have. It's important to understand that comorbid or coexisting conditions do affect the way in which that individual may respond, the way in which that individual may react, and the way in which that individual may be able to tolerate certain stimulus. That being said, you also want to look for the opportunities that that person has to use their strengths across each of those areas. When you're working with individuals with disabilities, it's important to recognize that person first is the most important aspect of working in these populations. They're a person before they're disabled. It's important to understand that politically correct language would not say the person with autism. We would say the young man was diagnosed with, or in terms of diagnostic criteria, he's a person before he's a diagnosis. And it's important when you talk to your team, whether you're on a dive boat, you're going on a Diveheart trip, you're working with your team on a Diveheart training, that you also recognize that you want that person-centered language to be as much of a focus for every member of the team, and that that's shared in respect for that individual. If any of us were referred to as being simply one thing, maybe the thing that challenges us the most, it limits our ability to see ourselves in a positive way. What Scuba does is offers a very positive and powerful experience for individuals who may have challenges that exist on land but in the water are removed. When you're working with someone with a physical impairment, they are truly freed in the water. They are, in a way, able to experience a world that is not available to them any other way. Being grounded in a wheelchair or to a surface all the time limits their own ability to experience freedom, but in the water, they are completely free. For someone with a communication handicap, being in a world where they're not required to communicate at the same verbal rate as non-disabled individuals allows them to see themselves in a different way. It shifts the paradigm from them being communication challenged to them being equal in that environment. All it requires is that they understand the hand signals and the safety concerns of the diving environment, whether that be in water or in open water. It's important to understand and recognize that that individual is the same under the water. Those barriers have really been removed. The power of scuba really is unlimited, whether it's in a confined water experience or an open water experience. Suddenly, for the first time, that individual may be able to experience a world that isn't hindered or restricted by their disability, but that is open just the same as their non-disabled peers. So when you're looking at someone, whether it be with a physical handicap or a communication handicap or an intellectual handicap, those barriers are removed in the underwater world. Keeping safety as your priority, understanding that person first, and applying your knowledge as an instructor or as a buddy will help them have a bigger picture of what life is about, help them see themselves in a more positive way, and from there, imagine a world with possibilities. It's also important to remember that cognitive or intellectual impairments are not always the result of a birth or developmental issue. They can also be the result of TBI, or traumatic brain injury. For our veterans coming back from the war, they may have physical disabilities as a result of their duties, but they also may have intellectual challenges based on the result of a traumatic brain injury. An acquired traumatic brain injury that results in impaired intellectual functioning for an individual can manifest in different ways. Their comprehension may be affected, their long and short-term memory may be affected, as well as the way in which they interact with people in their lives, both prior to their duties in the military and then coming home. You have to be considerate of the fact that, especially as a soldier, they left a life behind, were injured in duty, and have come back now with challenges that can be significant in their life. Socially, someone with a cognitive or intellectual impairment are going to have different responses. They're going to have different interactions, and they're going to have differences in the way in which they see themselves. And we see this, we hear about it on the news oftentimes, dealing with not just maybe the results of a TBI or a traumatic brain injury, but the post-traumatic stress disorder that comes with it, and being aware of the way in which those may manifest in that individual. It goes back to also thinking about, in terms of other disabilities, the same way that fatigue and exhaustion and the way physiology may influence those areas as well. When you're working with a veteran, per se, on a Diveheart trip or a Diveheart training, it's important to understand the challenges that that individual has, not just as a result of his disability, but as a result of the way in which he or she now sees themselves, helping encourage them to be the most able-bodied as possible, the most independent as possible, respecting them, acknowledging their sacrifice and acknowledging their service, while allowing them to really be in a world where they're accepted for the changes that they've experienced and honor the sacrifice that they made is an important part of working with these young soldiers that are returning from war and having challenges significant. They've left a world behind and have come back to a different world, learning to navigate not just occupations or social, not just learning to navigate realms of enjoyment. Someone that prior to their war service may have been an active mountain climber but has come back and may have a physical impairment that limits their ability to do the things that they once did, but may have new opportunities through Diveheart to have the opportunity to develop new skills. It's important to understand that with that sacrifice was more than just a physical or an intellectual impairment as a result of a traumatic brain injury or a physical injury, but there's an emotional side to always look at as well. To understand the term intellectual disability or intellectual impairment really does equate to the range in which the person's intellectual functioning is measured on an IQ or intellectual functioning test. A mild to moderate impairment would fall in the range of 70 or higher on an IQ test. A moderate to severe would range below 70 to about 50, and below 50 would fall into the severe range of impairment. Understanding that an IQ test does not equate to abilities, especially when communication challenges exist. A person taking an IQ test has to respond in a certain way in order to score on that test. Someone with communication challenges may not be able to score on that test in the same way as a non-disabled or more able peer, but does not limit the fact that they do have skills that may not yet be recognized. Approximately 80% of all cognitive disabilities fall in the range of mild mental retardation to moderate mental retardation and severe mental retardation. Other common cognitive disabilities that are recognized are autism and Down syndrome. Autism right now in our country today falls in a prevalence of 1 in 90 diagnosed with autism. So the likelihood of you as an instructor or a buddy working with someone with autism is very, very high. The opportunities that you have in working with young adults or children with autism will benefit you as you understand this disability. Autism is considered a spectrum disorder. It ranges from mild to moderate to severe. And as a spectrum, skill sets can fall across that range. You can have skills that are very strong in one area and skills that are more deficit in another area, and that's what makes it a spectrum disorder. Spectrum disorders actually do represent other disabilities as well, but they're most commonly recognized with the autism population. For people working with individuals diagnosed on the autism spectrum, it's important to understand that communication will be impaired, social interactions are impaired, as well as idiosyncratic or stereotypical behaviors. Those are the diagnostic criteria for autism. When you're working with someone diagnosed with autism, they may have strong verbal abilities. They may have limited verbal abilities. It may be difficult for you to understand if they're listening to you or paying attention to you, as eye contact may be impaired. But understanding begins with knowing the individual. Knowing the individual can come through interviewing the parent, working with a caregiver, or just talking with the student for just a few minutes to understand their communication style, understand their comprehension, and also understand what they would like to do in terms of learning to scuba dive. The Diveheart Foundation works with a range of disabilities. They work with individuals with autism and cognitive impairments, and so when you're working towards the opportunity to provide scuba therapy for individuals with cognitive disabilities, the most important thing for you to remember is that each person is an individual. They will have skills in one area, they may not have as many skills in another area, and learning with cognitive impairments may just require more time. It does require that the instructor or buddy be very patient. Demonstrations are very, very powerful. The comprehension may be limited for auditory processing, but their visual comprehension may be very strong. So when you're working with an individual diagnosed with autism or another cognitive impairment that affects communication, one of your strongest tools is using visual modeling. One of the things you can do if you're wanting to see if the individual is understanding what information you're giving them is just use simple phrases like "show me" or "tell me" to see what they're actually able to understand. It is important for you as an instructor or a buddy working with individuals with autism to understand their communication needs. Some individuals on the autism spectrum can have high verbal abilities but have deficits in their comprehension. So it's important that you always check back with that individual and understand what they're comprehending from the material that you're giving them for safety and for their own welfare. One of the areas that you would look at working with individuals diagnosed with autism is also the area of social. One of the opportunities that comes from scuba diving is that the world is open to them on a very equal level. Is it social? Yes, there's interactions between the dive instructor or the dive buddy and the individual, but it's not based on pragmatics of language, and it's not based on social norms in terms of interactions that require them to communicate at the level of non-impaired individuals. When you're working with a young adult or a child with autism, it's important for you to understand their communication needs. It's important for you to recognize that although they may verbally be able to express themselves very clearly, to always go back and give the comprehension check-in. When you're teaching an individual with autism the basics of scuba diving, it's important for you to understand how best to communicate with them. When you're working with a very high-functioning individual with autism, skill sets will be acquired very rapidly. When you're working with a younger child or an individual that's more significantly impaired, it would be the best opportunity for you to just move at a slower rate and try to make it fun. Try to help the individual relax, help them understand that this is just an opportunity for them to experience scuba, maybe for the first time or in a way that they would be able to build towards their skills. When you're working with them, allow them to touch and handle all of the equipment. Don't approach them and expect them to allow you to put the equipment on them without having first allowed them to touch the equipment. Let them feel it, explain it to them, let them ask you questions. Explain the importance of what each piece of equipment does. Perhaps model it for them first and allow them to experience it in a way that works best for their learning style. When you're working with children specifically, it's important for you to understand that although they may be able to handle certain aspects of the equipment, they may be able to handle the regulator, they may not be able to handle the regulator, you will have to kind of gauge your pace when working with them according to their tolerance of the stimulus. If you are able to read their body language, watch for the nuances that change within them as they are given more stimulus in the learning environment, you will know how to pace their instruction. You will also be able to recognize that although they may have different tolerances for things, those dynamics may change according to water temperature, according to their own regulation and according to the environment that they're in. Sometimes in a pool area it can be very loud. Children with autism can have sensitivity to loud noise. Children with autism can also have sensitivity to bright light, so it's important to understand if they need to wear a hat or if they need to have sunglasses. It would be important to understand what types of sensory input may be aversive to them before putting them in the environment that you're hoping to teach them in. And that can come through, like we've talked about previously, interviewing the families, interviewing the individual, or just noticing subtle nuances. Body language is an important part of all disabilities. You'll be able to read their body language through subtle changes. And also, it's important to understand that tolerances will vary from day to day, depending on what's happening with that individual. So one day, if you work with an individual and they seem to have really, really strong interactions, they're able to understand their skills and comprehend their skills, and you were given the opportunity to work with that individual again, and they just seem to maybe not quite have the same interaction, the same level of involvement, to take it back to a level of teaching and instruction which is first enjoyable and secondary person-centered. So you're looking at what's happening with that individual. It's important for you to also understand when working with individuals with autism that sensory input from you can come in the form of pacing, that if you're working at a level that they are not comfortable with, to just back it down and work at a slower rate. When you're in the water with individuals with autism, communication becomes so much less of an issue. So really the communication component for working with individuals with autism happens on the pool side or on the boat. On a Diveheart trip, you're going to want to really prepare for the team to understand the communication needs and the social interactions of the individuals diagnosed with autism. Someone diagnosed with autism may need to have just little breaks, may need to have little times where they can just actually sort of decompress and be able to allow to just sort of have their own personal space again. That can be very difficult on a dive boat. That can be very difficult on a trip. And so when you're working with those individuals, it comes back to understanding, once again, the whole idea of pacing and understanding the way in which they respond to stimulus. If you're on a boat and you see the individual that you've been working with successfully on poolside suddenly begin to have characteristic behaviors that may seem out of character for that individual, begin to question, is it the noise of the boat? Is it aversive stimulus that may come from having people in a personal space environment that they may not be comfortable with? It's also important when you're working on, especially in a boat environment, that you understand the safety realm for that individual. Where do they feel the most safe? Where are they going to be the most safe at? It's going to be difficult if the boat is loud. It could be difficult if there's weather conditions. Those are all areas that will affect someone on the autism spectrum in a way that may produce a different presentation than the one that you're used to. Not so much very different from the rest of us. Some days we have opportunities that inspire us and we're really able to enjoy it, and some days we really are not able to enjoy things at the same level. So understanding the characteristics of different stimulus is important with working with any cognitive impairment, but especially autism. When you're working with an individual with autism, it's also important for you to understand that their social interactions are differentiated by the way in which they process information, by the way in which they respond. They are very, very curious about certain areas often, but don't know how to express it. They may display what could be considered inappropriate behaviors as they seek to understand information. It's important when you're also working with an individual diagnosed with autism that you understand social differences and social norms are part of the spectrum, and to not expect them to respond in a way that a non-disabled or non-impaired individual would respond. That being said, building strong relationships really does help in terms of interactions with that individual. It also helps in terms of helping them have a better understanding of the social world. Another important factor to take into consideration when working with individuals with intellectual impairment or cognitive disabilities is their desire for independence may not correlate to their ability level. They may have strong desires to be independent, but their skill sets may not match the desire that they have for that level of independence. it is important to allow them to have as much independence as possible with keeping safety as your number one priority. When you go through your Diveheart training, you will experience many of these challenges yourself in the underwater environment. You will experience many of the challenges of a physical disability. It's very difficult, though, to replicate that in a cognitive or intellectual ability. That being said, when you look at someone that has a very strong desire to be independent, that you find even small ways to allow them to experience that opportunity of independence. That may become in very, very small ways where they're carrying their own equipment, or they're helping you assemble their equipment, or they're helping themselves to the greatest extent possible, whether it be in a transfer or on or off the boat, but doing it in a way that safety is number one. Other types of cognitive disabilities or intellectual impairments to be at least aware of and knowledgeable about are in the area of cerebral palsy and Down syndrome. Diveheart has requirements that all individuals go through medical screening, which reduces the risk for someone diagnosed with Down syndrome to have complications while diving. That being said, it is important to also understand that communication challenges are part of the realm of Down syndrome, that for individuals with Down syndrome, they may have difficulties with attending to a task or attending to an activity for a prolonged period of time. So as an instructor or a buddy, you just want to be aware that they may have a shorter interest. They may be able to tolerate that environment for a shorter time before they're actually wanting to get out of the water or get out of the equipment and move on to something else. That can be said for a lot of disabilities, though, not just Down syndrome, but Down syndrome especially because of the nature of having intellectual impairment, their range of interest may be more limited, their tolerance to things may be more limited. So you want to just be aware that when you're working with that individual, that their own regulation and receptivity to that activity may last for a shorter amount of time. It's important to not set a goal for a time on a dive, set a goal for a time in the water, but to make that experience just as meaningful as possible for that individual. Whether it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 50 minutes, that the opportunity that they have in the aquatic environment give them as much of a reward as it could for anybody else, but let them do it on their terms. Individuals with cerebral palsy present complications in their motor functioning. Cerebral palsy is the result of a brain injury either in utero or at birth. 80% of individuals that have cerebral palsy also have some form of intellectual impairment. That being said, the other 20% may have only mild appearances of motor function issues. For someone diagnosed with cerebral palsy that also has intellectual challenges, you just want to work at a pace that's comfortable for that individual. You don't want to rush them. You don't want to put them in positions where they are not able to process and regulate through the demands of the environment, which is said for most every disability as well. When you're working with someone with cerebral palsy, it's important to understand the type of motor function that they have, from the very, very loose, elastic sort of muscular system to the very, very tight or rigid muscular system. It's important also when you're working with someone with cerebral palsy to understand that their communication styles may change as fatigue or exhaustion are a factor. For many individuals that I've worked with cerebral palsy, their communication can actually change as their bodies actually begin to fatigue or begin to tire. So it's important to understand that and be watching for those signs as you're either entering the water or exiting the water especially. The in-water experience, unless they're wearing an AGA mask, wouldn't require them to have communication skills, but once they're either out of the pool or out of the water on a boat or on a shore dive, you would want to watch for those things, which really just mean they just may need to take a rest. Their limitations can range from mild to moderate. Physically, many of them are ambulatory. For others, though, they may have ambulatory concerns that limit their activities outside of water to the use of a wheelchair. Many of my students that I've worked with cerebral palsy can either partially transfer or fully transfer themselves, but it's important to understand if they do have ambulatory concerns, the way in which they would like to be transferred, or the level of assistance that they want in a transfer. It's also important to empower them to do as much for themselves as possible. Cerebral palsy can have physical presentations that do not indicate cognitive presentations. So it's important to understand that that individual may have a strong desire for independence and to allow them the opportunity to be as independent as possible while you're working with them. of the opportunities that is unique to Diveheart and unique to scuba diving is that it can be a great equalizer for individuals with disabilities to experience with the same success as their non-disabled peers. My son's story is unique in that before he was given the opportunity to scuba dive, his interactions and his interests were very, very limited. His first trip to the Cayman Islands was really extraordinary in that suddenly a whole new world was opened up to him, as only can happen in certain environments. That environment wasn't based on his communication skills, because underwater we can communicate with hand signals, so suddenly his communication deficits really diminished. He was in an environment that wasn't restricted by understanding communication needs and sensory processes beyond his realm of comfort. He was in a nourishing environment in that his sensory system responded well to the pressure and responded well to the stimulus of the underwater world. His story is unique in that before my son was given the opportunity to try scuba diving, we had a very difficult time encouraging him to experience new activities. When we were given the opportunity for him to experience scuba diving, there was a hesitation if he would be able to withstand the pressures, if he would be able to complete the skills, if he would be able to benefit from this type of interaction with adaptations to that environment, with people like Jim Elliott of Diveheart who were able to understand and work within his areas of deficit as well as recognizing his areas of strength. For my son, we saw powerful changes with him. He went from, on the surface, being a young man with autism, with communication challenges, with sensory processing challenges, to being underwater and being completely equal to everyone around him. It didn't require any special skills. It didn't require any special tools. He was equal for the first time, just as anybody else would be in that environment. It wasn't based on his comprehension. It wasn't based on his own personal skill set in terms of being able to actively seek that. It was an instant feedback for him in the water. Returning from his first dive trip to Little Cayman, we saw huge changes in his overall interest and receptivity to trying new things. Prior to experiencing scuba diving, my son spent about 80% of his day in the special ed classroom. He had entered into high school. We were trying to encourage him to try elective classes. We were trying to encourage him to experience some new opportunities, joining a sports team, joining some sort of club, and he was very, very resistant to these things. After returning from scuba diving, his independence and his self-esteem had increased so much that he actually chose to leave the special education classroom, spending 80% of his day outside of the special education classroom. He enrolled in cooking classes for his electives. He enrolled in a health science class. He enrolled, actually for the first time, he showed interest in learning to drive. Up to that point, he hadn't even shown interest in learning to drive. And it was really a miracle to watch the blossoming of his spirit as he was receptive to trying new things. Given the opportunity to again experience scuba diving on a second trip with Diveheart and Camp H2O, Derek furthered his own receptivity and his own initiation of new experiences. He went from 80% to 90% outside of the special education classroom and never returned to that type of learning environment. What I see is that Derek really saw that he was just like everybody else. If he could scuba dive, he was just like everybody else. And from that time, he has shown interest in a range of activities. He's played on his high school basketball team, he ran track, and he also wanted to become a skydiver, which for a young man with sensory processing concerns was interesting to me. He had never even gone on a roller coaster before experiencing scuba diving, and his receptivity to new environments, also his tolerance for new environments really increased, and that to me speaks powerfully of what scuba diving can do for someone with a spectrum disorder such as autism. Now my son actually is open to travel. He's open to new experiences. He's open to trying new things in a way that prior to his first dive trip was not available to him due to his own interest, due to his own limitations. Now he sees himself as able. He sees himself as a regular guy, and what a more powerful thing could we do for anyone than that?